The four global systems that we have are the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. But before looking at a combined cycle of all four of them, we first need to understand the key features of each cycle. The water cycle looks at the way water is collected, purified, and distributed throughout the earth. It starts off with around 96% of the Earth's water being stored in the oceans. From here, water is evaporated into the clouds where it will then condensate and change from the form of vapor into liquid and finally precipitate or rain. On top of this, we have surface runoffs and rivers that can transport the water from one location to another, and there are also a considerable amount of water transpired from plants. The carbon cycle is essential to all living organisms as it provides a chemical framework for molecules such as carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acid. It is present throughout the atmosphere, oceans, and rocks. Cellular respiration extracts carbon and releases it into the atmosphere, while photosynthesis gives carbon to living organisms. Carbon is also moved throughout the atmosphere through combustion that occurs in factories and through fossil fuels. Through burning fossil fuels, carbon is released into the atmosphere. Decaying also releases carbon from the earth into the atmosphere. The nitrogen cycle is very vital and is essential in all living organisms as it is needed for the essential parts of nucleic acid and proteins. The Earth's atmosphere is about 80% nitrogen in the form of N2. Much of the action happens underground as there are many important processes that occur below the surface. When animals die, they decompose, and through the process of ammonification, the nitrogen that was in the dead organism is recycled. This becomes in the form of NH3, or otherwise known as ammonia. Then nitrification occurs, where the ammonia changes form into nitrite, then finally nitrate. Then it is available to plants and animals in the form of NO3 gas and is absorbed, which is called assimilation. Also, atmospheric nitrogen can go through fixation when lightning occurs or with legumes such as peas and beans, as the N2 nitrogen is converted into nitrogen compounds. The phosphorus is important as it is needed to help store energy in ATP, DNA, and lipids or fats. Rain causes the rock to weather and release phosphate. Also, there is inorganic phosphate in the soil. Plants take the phosphate through their roots, whilst animals simply eat from the plants to receive this phosphate. Once the animal or plant dies, they decompose and return the phosphate back to the soil. There are also bacteria that help convert organic phosphate into inorganic phosphate so it is ready for consumption. Phosphorus is then washed into water and ends up in sediments in lakes, rivers, or oceans. Now that we know about each of the global cycles, we need to look at how they link together. There are a number of human influences or problems that these cycles have in common, which link them together. And all cycles rely on one another, so their general function is quite similar. The water cycle can affect the carbon cycle, as carbon that reacts with seawater creates carbonic acid. If there is too much carbonic acid present, it can lead to acid rain, which can have harmful effects on plants, aquatic animals, and infrastructure. Also, the ocean removes carbon from the atmosphere, cutting down on the amount of atmospheric carbon. Deforestation is where there is a clearance of a forest or an area with many trees. Cutting down trees is a bad problem for a few cycles. Cutting down trees releases carbon into the atmosphere, and there is already an increasing amount of carbon in the atmosphere. A study taken shows that 2 to 3 gigatons of carbon is released into the atmosphere from deforestation and soil disruption per year, which is a huge amount. This is worsening the climate change problem, as our climate is changing where the carbon amount in the atmosphere is growing too unstably. Global warming is another problem that is increasing. This is where the average temperature is increasing, and the reason for this is because of the increase in carbon dioxide emissions. The mean temperature has increased by 2.6 degrees from 1920 to 2000. Carbon is an element that is able to absorb some of the heat energy released from the Earth. A carbon molecule will absorb some heat energy, then has to release some of the energy to stabilize it. The energy that is released is either let out into the Earth or it goes back to space. And as much of this energy is staying on Earth, the atmosphere is warming, and this is a problem that needs to be stopped by us limiting the number of trees that are cut down to lower the carbon emissions. Deforestation also affects the water cycle, as trees have water vapor in them. Only when trees are alive can that water vapor be released into the atmosphere. By cutting down many trees, much of the water is being trapped inside trees, and we aren't getting as much water as possible. Around 300 litres of water is used to make 1 kilogram of paper, and if our body requires us to have at least 8 glasses of water per day, we really need to rethink our priorities. Also, the factories are releasing too much carbon into the atmosphere. In 1900, the carbon dioxide emissions from petrol, coal, cement production and gas flaring were taken, and a total of 0.5 billion metric tons of carbon is produced every year into the atmosphere. In 2000, this amount increased to a whopping 9 billion metric tons of carbon. This shows a huge and unstable increase, which began with the Industrial Revolution led by Europe in the 1760s. However, now all countries across the globe are contributing to this amount. A way to target this problem is by introducing a carbon tax, which we will discuss later. Irrigation is a huge problem, as much water is extracted from its natural source and moved to another place. By doing this, the original area loses the nutrients it once had and leads farmers to opting to fertilizers to help rebalance the growth. However, there's a problem involved with these fertilizers. Nitrogen-based fertilizers are used and they result in an imbalance of nutrients and consequently the loss of biodiversity. According to a study made by a scientist named Johnson, in 2010 there is also an increase in parasitic and infectious diseases. This increase in diseases is a result of the nitrogen-based fertilizers. And what happens is when an amount of any element is injected into a certain area, the area may react negatively to this reaction, and this problem is called eutrophication, where there is an excessive richness which leads to the death of organisms. This relates not only to nitrogen but phosphorus as well. Phosphorus is used as a limiting agent in lakes, and when injected, the new amount leads to some plants thriving whilst many may die. This leads to the variety of species declining considerably. There is in total around 54% of problems that are reported in Southeast Asia regarding all lakes and reservoirs are related to eutrophication, and this number is 53% in Europe, 28% in Africa, 41% in South America, and 48% in North America. These figures are remarkably high. Phosphate rock is the main source of phosphorus. Many understand phosphorus's potential and mine it to create fertilizers. In Australia, the main phosphate mines are in Phosphate Hill, which is in Queensland, and Christmas Island. Through this, a study was conducted to monitor the amount of phosphorus that was being extracted from mining. In 2007, it was slightly under 100 tons, and as of 2011, it reached a whopping 950 tons. This is an overwhelming amount of phosphorus being extracted from its original source, which may result in an imbalance of nutrients altering the rock. Also, these phosphate fertilizers are then used in organic farming systems, and though many argue that it is a good fertilizer because it's soluble and it's either washed away into waterways or into the soil, it's a good thing to use it. However, it's taking away the natural phosphorus from its original source, which is then altering the balance, which can cause many problems later. The carbon tax forces polluters to pay a certain amount of money per ton of carbon that they emit into the atmosphere. Thank you for listening.